Hey, welcome back. Today's video is about brass life. Now, when we think about brass life, we typically think about things like loosened primer pockets, incipient head separations, and neck cracks as being life limiters for our brass. Sometimes we think about developing clickers and not being able to size it enough to make it extract effectively. That's another way that brass sometimes dies. But there's another way yet that brass tends to die and get thrown in the recycling bin, and that is loss of confidence. Now, shooters lose confidence in their brass for a variety of reasons, usually because a rifle isn't shooting well. And that leads to a lot of questions that I receive on a regular basis about how many firings are too many firings, and when will the brass start to negatively impact the precision and accuracy of the rifle system. Well, I've got news for you. I don't have all the answers to this. I'm not going to sit here and hypothesize and pronounce myself as the utmost expert on this particular subject, because I'm not. Instead, I'm going to give you the benefit of my experience of over a decade of competitive shooting at a very high level to show you what I've observed and hopefully give you some ideas on how best to keep your brass in good competitive shape for its entire life until one of the three big ones happens: loose primer pocket, incipient head separation, or neck cracks. So guys, let's delve pretty deeply into brass life for precision and see if we can't come up with some answers that might help you with your decisions whether to abandon your brass and get new, or maybe do a little bit of work to keep it serviceable. So the first thing we have to understand is the neck is a source of a lot of issues and a lot of concerns in brass. I've done a video on annealing. It's right there if you want to watch it. And that is all of my thoughts, which have not changed, on annealing and how it affects brass life. The thing to consider here is the neck is going to get harder with each and every firing and each and every sizing unless you anneal. So if you're not annealing, that neck gets harder and harder and harder, and it does so relatively quickly. The first 5 or 6 firings, it's going to kind of hit a peak. So the next reason that brass will lose precision, in my experience, is primer crush. Now, you're probably asking, what does primer crush have to do with the brass age? Let me explain. When I started in F-class, I didn't want to do a whole lot of brass prep, but being an F-class shooter, I worked pretty quickly into self-flagellation and having to do all kinds of processes to the brass. If you want to see all the processes that I did to F-class brass, it's right there in that video. Uniforming primer pockets was one of those items. Uniforming primer pockets in and of itself doesn't have a beneficial effect on precision or accuracy, in my opinion. On the other hand, it does have a beneficial effect long term. Here's why. Once you've uniformed primer pockets, the best tool for cleaning them is the primer pocket uniformer, especially if you're using one of the non-adjustable uniforming tools like the Sinclair units that I use. When you're cleaning those primer pockets, you'll start to notice after a few firings that you're starting to take a little bit of brass out again. And then a few firings, you're taking brass out again. You start to scratch your head and wonder why this might be. Let me show you why it is. This section case shows very well that the case head is thinnest right at the primer pocket. In other words, the force against that portion of the head is going to distort that little bit of head just a little bit with each and every firing. Now, there's a hole through the middle that's going to let the gas out into the primer area and equalize the pressure across it. But it takes just a blink for that to happen. And during that time, there are forces against this brass. Now, that movement of the brass is very, 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 did I say very? Small. As a matter of fact, it is so small that it is almost undetectable with most primer pocket measuring tools for 1 or 2 firings. But by the time you get to 5, 10, 20, 30 firings, you can tell. You can tell very easily that it's moving that primer pocket. Now, if you're using a uniforming tool, that uniforming tool starts to scrape brass out at every other firing or so. And that's your indication that it has grown just enough that the tool can cut it again. So how does this affect primer crush? Well, if you think about it, if the primer pocket base moves 1/10,000th of an inch, yes, 3 zeros before the 1 here, and that movement continues throughout the life of the brass, by the time you get to 30 firings, it has moved 3/1000th of an inch. Now, if your primer pockets were excessively deep from the beginning, I can think of a few brands that are that way, or if you're using very short primers, you're not going to have a problem. However, if you're using one of the taller brands of primers, and you already had relatively minimal depth primer pockets, you're going to get to a situation where your primers tend to be proud after being seated properly. What do you do about it? Well, most shooters simply crush them a little more to put them flush with the head, or worse yet, they're using a stopped tool to make sure that they are getting below the case head for safety's sake. And I will say that that is a really good idea to have that primer below the case head. Proud primers are not good. It's non-negotiable. the primers have to be below the head of the case. If we have to crush the primers more and more and more and more as we get further into the brass life, we're going to get to a point where eventually we start crushing the primers so much that we're damaging the priming pellet inside the primer when we seat the primer. Damage to primer pellets is a well-known cause of high ES and SD, as well as variations in accuracy and precision based on differing harmonics from shot to shot. Think a crushed primer pellet versus one that is intact. That difference alone is enough to throw flyers. So how do we control this? By primer pocket uniforming. Now, as an example, my 6 dasher brass, that alpha OCD brass that I've been shooting the PRS rifle, yes, I shoot pretty hot loads for most of my PRS stuff, it's moving the primer pockets. I never uniformed them from the beginning. But now I'm getting to the point where properly seated primers are a little proud, half a thousandths, 1/1000ths. That's a no-go for me. So what do I do about it? That's right. I uniform the primer pockets to get them to a consistent depth. That consistent depth with the CCI 450 primer that I'm using results in a primer cup that is sitting 1/1000ths below the head of the case with a properly seated primer. So what's that going to do to the accuracy? Absolutely nothing. That's the whole intent. It doesn't change anything, except it extends the life of the brass before the brass no longer shoots. In other words, I don't have to worry about the brass becoming inaccurate or imprecise in shot placement. Instead, I can shoot it with great confidence and know that the bullets are going to go where I want them to until such time as the brass eventually breaks just due to old age. Remember, annealing the neck softens the neck. It doesn't soften the body. Eventually, that body is going to either crack or stretch to the point where, yep, that's right, we get an incipient head separation. Worse yet, if you're like me and tend to shoot kind of warm loads, at some point, those primer pockets are going to loosen up. That is for normal brass. This OCD brass, I've done some pretty wild stuff to it and haven't managed to loosen a primer pocket yet. But I'll keep trying, just for the sake of experimentation. Leave me a comment below. Do you uniform primer pockets from the beginning? Are you willing to uniform them later in the life of the brass to make sure that the brass lasts longer? Or are you one that would rather just pitch the brass and get new, rather than do all the work and self-flagellation of primer pocket uniforming? Leave me a comment below and let me know. While you're at it, let me know if you anneal or not and how often. Until next time, shoot straight. Make sure you have new brass ready because it eventually does die. And I'll see you in the next video.